Hey guys, Molton here with another opening repertoire video. Today's focus is all about the Scandinavian. It's one of the very first openings I learned with the black pieces, and I've gone through and updated some of my old lines to give it a fresh new modern perspective. So stick around to the very end and you should have a complete working repertoire. So we'll get started by looking at black's main and most common setups, as well as what we're aiming for in terms of piece placement, and some of white's sideline options. After e4, d5, pawn takes, queen takes, the most common option here for white is to play the move knight to c3, hitting the queen with tempo, but he can also play the move knight to f3. So after knight to f3, the one I suggest is bishop to g4, putting immediate pressure on the knight, and after bishop to e2, playing the move knight c6 here, which leads to some very interesting and sharp positions after black is able to queenside castles. And I would take a deeper look into this if you want something very double-edged, but another option is just to play the move knight to f6, which will most likely transpose back into this particular repertoire, because the most popular move here for white again is to go knight to c3. So if after queen takes d5, knight c3 is played immediately, then we can go the move queen to a5. The other retreats, queen d6 and queen d8, are also possible, but in this particular repertoire I'm just going to be focusing on the move queen to a5 instead. Here the main moves will include d4, knight f3 and bishop to c4, but first we'll look at some of the sideline options, starting with the move pawn to b4. This is some sort of wing gambit where black is happily able to just accept the pawn sacrifice, and white is trying to get some open lines for the rook and the bishops and knights. After rook b1, queen goes to d6, pawn d4, knight goes to f6, knight f3. It's very important in this particular position that black plays the move pawn to a6. So instead of playing c6, which we would normally play in most positions in the Scandinavian, here it's better to play a6. The reason is that white will almost always bring the bishop out to the c4 square, and he's looking to play the move knight to e5, bishop to f4. But here we can answer with a strong reply. Pawn goes to b5, the bishop goes back to d3. If the bishop goes to b3, then we'll still play the move pawn to e6, where the bishop will be shut out of the game. After this we play bishop to b7, knight e5 for example, and I'll include a few more moves, for example e6, bishop f4. The queen here can just drop back to the d8 square. Of course we don't take on d4 because this is not free, because white can just play the move bishop takes b5 and get a nasty discovered check, picking up our queen on d4. But after the move queen to d8, I think black has a very healthy position, and we're just a pawn up as far as I can see. Another option early on is to play the move pawn to g3. So this one is a favorite of strong Indian Grandmaster Sasi Kiran. After the move pawn to g3, white's idea is that black will almost often play the move pawn to c6, after which the bishop on g2 followed by a quick rook b1, b4, b5 will put a lot of pressure on this diagonal. It's a relatively simple plan and it can be very effective. So after knight f6, bishop g2, the main move here is to play c6, but you also have an extra option in the move knight to c6, which is also a very interesting alternative. I think the best response here for white is to go knight f3, and then you can play maybe e5 or bishop d7, followed by bishop b4 or bishop d7 and queenside castling. Is very interesting positions. Most people here will play the move pawn to d3 though, after which bishop g4 is a very strong move. And if knight f3, you can play knight e5, and at worst I think black is close to equalizing already. One game continued knight to e2, after which black continued with the move knight to d4, already putting a lot of pressure on these two pins, one pin along this diagonal and one here. And the best move for white here is to play the move king to f1, But in that particular game, white tried to unpin from both simultaneously with the move queen to d2, but he is already lost here. Fell into a tactic after bishop takes e2, and now if knight takes e2, we have knight takes c2, and we're hitting the rook, and the queen is pinned. So we'll just trade queens and be material up. Instead, the move b4 was played to try and complicate the position somewhat. The idea is that if we take on b4, then white will answer with rook to b1, just making position as messy as possible. Instead, after b4, black has a very interesting counter-attacking move, and that is bishop to f3. So after bishop to f3, the queen is on pre, but we're threatening to take the bishop on g2 and create a double threat simultaneously. So after pawn takes, bishop takes g2, we're threatening knight to f3 check, forking the king and queen, as well as picking up the rook. And don't forget that we're already 2 pieces up at this point. Queen to f4 is well met by queenside casting as well. And here white is completely lost because he's losing too much material. So knight c6 on move 5 is a very interesting option. Another one is just the main line, pawn to c6. And I think black is doing relatively okay here as well. On move 4, another option for white is to play bishop to c4, knight f6, and then instead of the main d4 move, white can just put the pawn on d3 instead. Now in terms of black setup, we almost always want the bishop outside the pawn chain. So this bishop is always going to go to f5 or g4, majority of cases, unless the bishop is going to be chased away in some form, or it's possible to bring the bishop to b7. This pawn will almost always go to c6 if the queen ever comes under any sort of threat, and this usually means from a knight heading towards c4 square, or in this particular case, it's because the bishop is heading towards d2. So after bishop d2, we don't really have time to play the move bishop to f5 because knight to d5 is a serious threat. So we don't want to go into a position where we have the double pawns unnecessarily, because it is more of a disadvantage than an advantage. So instead, after bishop d2, we should retreat the queen immediately to c7. Let's say white plays the move queen to e2 in order to enable queenside casting. This is a very popular sort of line for white. He could also play the move knight to g2. This is also a very interesting option. After which black can play the move pawn to g6, or he can play the bishop outside the pawn chain. All options here are very decent for black. After queen to e2, I'm suggesting the move pawn to b5 here as my favorite option. Bishop f5 has been played before, but I don't like these positions as much because the bishop often gets harassed and it can be quite difficult to deal with. So I'm suggesting we play a bit more actively and keep the bishop back. After b5, bishop goes to b3, e6, knight f3, and I'm suggesting bishop e7, castles, and then a5, going for this bishop on b3, a4, b4, knight e4 for example, castles, and this bishop will be heading towards the b7 square. So we'll continue with knight d7, c5, and we don't have any particular problems because all our pieces will be actively in the game. So now we'll take a look at lines where white opts for putting the knight on the e2 square instead of f3, and these can be very dangerous, so you should take them very seriously. After d4, knight f6, bishop goes to c4. You have the option here of playing bishop g4 or bishop f5. Now, I think bishop g4 is also very interesting and very good as well. If you can provoke the move pawn to f3, the bishop will just drop back to f5, and I don't think the move pawn to f3 helps white's position that much. Instead, it creates a lot of weaknesses. After the move knight e2, e6, castles. In this line, often we will delay putting the pawn on c6, instead opt for the move knight to d7 or knight c6 instead. After bishop d2, now because knight d5 is a threat, you can play the move pawn to c6, and I don't think black has any problems here at all. If the knight goes to d5 or e4, we retreat the queen backwards, and we can always recapture with the knight on f6. So I think this is very well for black. If instead on move 6 knight f3 is played, if you're comfortable with this position, you can continue with the same manner of e6 and c6, or if you want something a little bit more double-edged, you can even play the move knight c6 here and go for lines where you queenside castle and put immediate pressure on the d4 pawn. But for the purposes of this particular repertoire, I'm going to be focusing mainly on bishop f5. So after bishop f5, knight to e2, we should continue with the move pawn to e6. And after castles, here it's very important that you play the move knight b to d7. So do not play the move pawn to c6 here, because after the move knight g3, bishop goes back to g6 and f4. This is very dangerous position for black, and I don't recommend this at all, because f5 is coming, followed by queen e2 check, and white is scoring very well. If anything, I would suggest you play this from the white side, because sometimes you can catch black players off guard with the move order. But instead, knight bd7 is what I would recommend. And now after knight g3, if bishop d2, again, you want to play c6 whenever white is threatening to discover, get a discovery with the knight on c3. And for example, knight g3 now, the bishop can just drop back, and this more or less transposes to the game. The queen can always drop back without too many problems. f4 here is met by queen b6 as well, hitting the pawn on d4 with tempo, followed by queenside castling. Puts a lot of pressure on white's center. Knight g3, we can play the move bishop to g6, and now after f4, black can castle to the queen side. f5 is just met by captures, and we can follow by playing bishop to b4 maybe. We have the move knight to b6, we can put pressure on the d4 pawn. All we want to really keep an eye on is our queen on a5, so make sure that you have enough sufficient retreat squares for this queen, and make sure it doesn't get trapped. But otherwise, I think black is doing fine here. So now we'll look at some of the mainline options for white after knight c3, queen a5, d4, knight f6, knight f3. The bishop will often go outside the pawn chain, so bishop f5 is a very common move. And here we'll start with knight to e5. So after the move knight to e5, white is delaying bishop to c4 in order to allow the option of playing knight c4, where white will kick this queen on the a5 square, which doesn't have too many retreat squares. So after knight a5, you really need to play the move pawn to c6 in order to allow some retreat squares for the queen. In this position, white has a number of different options which you can choose from. So we'll start with the move pawn to g4, which is the direct attempt for white to just harass this bishop on the f5 square, which is often a problem if the pawn chain is already closed, so you need to watch out for this idea. In this particular case, the bishop has an extra square which it wouldn't have normally, and that's the square on e6. So we should play the bishop back to e6. It does block the pawn on e7, but this bishop on f8 will most likely develop to g7 square, or we'll play the move knight d7, putting pressure on white's pawns before that happens. For example, after the move knight c4 here, we can just retreat with queen c7, no problems here. And after bishop c4, we can play the move knight to d7, a very strong response, hitting this knight on e5, so creating a counterattack. If the bishop takes on e6, we can, instead of taking the bishop, we take the knight on e5, and now the bishop doesn't have too many retreat squares. Also, white can't take on e5 because queen takes e5 would pick up some material, So the only move for white here to maintain the initiative is to play the move queen to e2. The idea is that if we take the bishop, then white will take here, and the position remains very complicated in white's favor. So instead of doing this, we should play knight to g6, bishop goes back to b3, followed by e6, and I believe that black is already fully equalized in this position. If instead on move 7, white opts for knight to c4, then we can play the move queen to d8. I think this is better than the move queen to c7, because queen to f3 is a very common response which you should keep in mind whenever white plays the move knight to c4. And here we cannot capture the pawn on c2, it's just far too dangerous, because the bishop will end up coming to the f4 square with tempo, and you'll get hit with rook c1, d5, and it's very unpleasant. So the queen should go to d8 instead, and let's say knight to e3 is well met by bishop to g6, followed by a development of our pieces with e6, knight d7, and the bishop can freely go out. h4 is a good try by white to try and pose some problems here, which was played against Ian Rogers, a strong Australian Grandmaster who popularized the Scandinavian defense at the top level. h6, h5, bishop h7, d5 was played by his opponent, Emil Sutovsky, very strong Grandmaster. Of course, d5 has to be played here. If d5 isn't played here, then black would simply play the move pawn to e6 and stop it. After pawn takes, knight c6, bishop b5 was played, but after takes, queen takes, and simplifications in the center, Rogers simply castled here, and we attacked the knight on d5 as well as the pawn on c2 with a very pleasant position for black, at least equal. So knight c4 is perfectly fine on move 7. Another option on move 7 is to play bishop c4. This is far more common and made famous by a game played Vishy Anand with the white pieces, which happened after e6, g4, bishop went to g6, pawn goes to h4. A very important move you should remember here is the move knight to d7. Bishop d6 can also be played, but I think knight d7 is better. After knight takes d7, knight takes d7, h5, bishop goes to e4, rook h3, which was Vishy's idea to swing the rook to the e3 square and start an attack in the center. But I think nowadays it's well known that black is doing perfectly well in this position after bishop to d5. And for example, the game could continue bishop to d3, and you could play bishop to d6 here, followed by castles queenside and queen to c7, taking full control of this weakness on the f4 square. And this is probably, I would recommend as the easiest plan to play with the black side. I think black is doing perfectly well here. Another option on move 7 is to play the move bishop to d3, just trading off these light squared bishops. So we should be happy to do this. Queen takes, and now we should immediately put pressure on this knight on d7. So it's very common that you play knight d7 to put immediate pressure, because the longer you wait, the more problematic this knight on e5 can become. So for example, if you just casually play e6, then after castles, knight bd7 now is met by the move queen to g3, which Nakamura did manage to hold a draw here against Dominguez, but it was a little bit unpleasant to play with the black side. So instead, knight bd7 is recommended, and if white trades, then that's perfectly fine. And if white goes knight c4, queen c7 here is a common move that's played a lot, but after the move queen to f3, white is threatening to play the move bishop to f4. You can play this line and go knight to b6, but I think white is a little bit better if he knows what he's doing. Instead, I would recommend the move queen to a6 on move 9. So after queen a6, we're threatening to play knight to b6 and just fully equalize by trading the queens off the board, and we're also putting pressure along this diagonal. If white wants to avoid the queen trades, he may not be able to get his king safely castled. For example, queen to e2, if castles, then we have knight to b6, and here if white trades, then we can just trade queens and then recapture the knight, and b3 is met by the move pawn to e6 with no particular problems with black at all. So queen e2 met by e6, castles, and knight b6 with a completely equal position in my opinion. So now we'll move on to some of the mainline variations after white opts for putting the bishop to d2. Knight f3, bishop f5. Here bishop c4 is the main line, which we'll look at in a moment, but we'll start with bishop to d2 instead. e6, bishop c4 will transpose back into our main variation, so we'll look at some alternatives here, starting with knight to e4. So this is perfectly fine for black because we could just play the move queen to b6, and if white captures, we can just capture back. The double pawns don't really do anything for white because we have pressure here on the queen side and the d4 pawn already. However, on move 7, knight e5 for white is a much more serious alternative, and here black does need to be very careful of what he plays. We can't casually just play the move pawn to c6 here because g4 is a very strong reply. After bishop goes g6, pawn to h4, black is in a little bit of trouble here because compared to the main variation, which we looked previously with the bishop on c4 instead of d2, we had this pin on this knight on c3, so we always had the option of playing bishop e4 and escaping our bishop out of trouble. But here we don't have that luxury, so we need to instead avoid playing c6 and go for queen to b6 instead on move 7. After queen b6, we're hitting the pawns on b2 and d4. So the best move for white here to keep his initiative going is to play this move queen to f3. So we can't take these pawns just yet for tactical reasons. So instead we should play the move pawn to c6. And after castles queenside, knight bd7, knight c4, we can drop the queen back to the d8 square. So instead of bringing it to c7 where it can be hit again by bishop to f4, we don't want that extra tempo for white. So the queen will drop back, and next we can get our pieces organized to castle our king to safety and then think of attacking on the queen side. The knight can come to b6, maybe the knight can come to d5, etc. And I think black is doing okay in this position. If instead on move 6, white opts for the move bishop c4, we should play the move pawn to e6. And here bishop d2 is the best move, since if castles, we continue bishop b4, knight to e2, bishop d6, and black is already totally fine here. With the bishop on c4, we don't really have to worry about the pawn going to c4 or c5 anytime soon. So bishop d2 is the only real try for white to go for an advantage. And now the regular move for black in this position has always been to play the move pawn to c6. And after pawn to c6, white will often move the knight away to either e4 or to d5 with a discovered attack. The queen will drop back and white will capture here, often leaving black with these double pawns on the king side. Black will often bring the knight to d7, queen back to c7, bishop d6, and castle queenside, and this line is perfectly fine. You can play this one, although I tend to believe that white has a slight edge in most of the variations. But more recently, people have opted with the black side to avoid playing c6 and instead try to delay it as long as possible. And this is a more modern way of playing this opening. Instead playing bishop to b4, leaving room for the knight to come to c6 if you need. So after bishop b4, the idea is that we're not afraid to give up the bishop for the knight on c3, because often you can gain a lot of time. The bishop will end up misplaced on c3 when white recaptures, which gives you time to develop the rest of your pieces, and often the knight on c3 isn't a useful piece for white anyway. So it's okay to give up the bishop pair in this particular scenario. Here white has two main options, one is a3 and one is queen e2. So we'll start with the move queen to e2. So after queen e2 castles, this might transpose as well, but after castles queenside, knight c6. So a key variation you should know in this particular case is what happens if white plays the move a3 in this position. So here we don't actually need to capture the knight on c3 because we have a much better response, and that's the move bishop takes a3. Now for starters, white doesn't have any tricks here, so he can't go for anything like pawn to d5 because we can just capture, knight takes, and then we have the move bishop to b4, and always have these mating threats with queen to a1, so he can't really do this. So instead, if he captures the bishop on a3, then we can play the move queen takes a3, king goes to b1, and the key idea in this position is that we want to blast open the queen side because the king has no cover. It's missing an a, missing a b pawn, so we play the move pawn to b5 just to try and open up as many lines as possible. If knight takes b5, we have the move rook to b8, and we see white is in a lot of trouble here, mainly because of this bishop on f5. So he can't ever block this diagonal or this file with bishop to b3 because queen takes b3 is always an option. So after the move b5, let's say white plays the move bishop to d3 and just avoids the trade, avoids opening up the queen side. So we can continue rook b8. Let's continue a few more moves so you can just see how it works out. Let's say white takes on f5, we can recapture. The knight goes to a2. This is a good move, so moving the knight away from getting tempo by the pawn. b4, so black is looking to play the move pawn to b3. Bishop c1, again a very strong move. Queen a4. Bishop goes to b2, knight goes to e4. So we're threatening to play the move knight to c3 here. So let's say plays rook to d3. We can continue with rook f to e8. So we can see that every move black is playing comes with a very strong threat. And despite being a whole piece up here, it doesn't really matter because the king is just so open and there's just a lot of tactics in this position. Rook e3. So black could continue rook to e6. And let's say d5 is hit by the move knight to c3. This is just one sample variation so you can see exactly how this attack would play out. And here already black is completely winning. For example, knight takes, pawn takes, and because of this pin on the queen, we can't take back with the rook, and obviously we can't take the rook because of checkmates on the back rank here. So as you can see, it can be very dangerous if white plays a3. So if he's going to play a3, he may as well just play a3 before he castles. This would be a much safer option to do it. After which we will give up our bishop for the knight and then drop the queen back to the b6 square. So this is a very key idea which has been played a lot by a lot of strong players very recently, especially in faster time control chess. So here castles has been played before, as well as the move queen to e2 and b3. So there's a couple of options white has tried. After queen e2, we can opt for castling, castles queenside, and knight c6. And I think black is doing relatively okay here. White has possibilities for a kingside attack, but I think overall, because the fact that his bishops are semi-blocked, I think black has sufficient resources here to sort of defend his kingside. If instead b3, you can play knight c6, castles, and castles should just be totally equal. You could even castle queenside here, although it looks a little bit riskier to me, because of queenside attack, but it's not that easy for white to get the queenside attack going. Like if he plays b4, you can always blockade the pawns. If the pawn goes to b5, maybe you play the knight to a5. And if pawn to a4, maybe you play the pawn to a5. So it's not that straightforward for white at all to push through on the queen side either. And if instead castles is played, then you can opt for just knight c6. And castles queenside is probably the most ambitious way, although castles kingside is very, very safe. And playing something along the lines of just bringing the rook to the d8 square and maybe dropping the bishop back to g6. I think this is more or less equal and black shouldn't have too many problems. So castles queenside is a little bit more ambitious, and for example h3, we could play moves such as bishop to e4 or knight to e4 is an option sometimes if the rook is already on e1 and the bishop has no retreat squares. And one game continued, knight to e5 here, bishop g6, the knight went back, bishop went to h5, and already black is putting pressure with this pin and provoking white to play this move, pawn to g4, in a game Alexev versus Laznica, where black went on to take advantage of the weaknesses and win the game. So that's my brief summary and suggestions on each of variations in the Scandinavian. I hope you enjoyed this video and can try it out in your own games. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.